The invitation arrived on a silver tray, and for a long moment, Cecily Vane did not pick it up. She stood in the narrow corridor outside the East Wing's linen room, where Mrs. Farrow had given her a bedroom 2 days ago with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had long since learned not to question the household's reversals. The note was sealed with the Ashford crest in dark wax, and it had been delivered by the under-footman with the particular formality people used when they were uncertain of rank. She was not a guest. She was not staff. She was something the house had not yet named, and the young footman's uncertain bow had made that plain. She broke the seal. The Duke of Ashford requested the pleasure of her company at dinner. That evening, 7 o'clock. Cecily read it twice. Then she set it down on the tray, folded her hands, and looked out the corridor window at the November gardens going gray in the afternoon light. 3 years ago, she had left Ashford Park through the servants' entrance at the back of the East Wing, her trunk on the cart ahead of her, the letter from the Duke's solicitor folded in her pocket. The letter had been correct in every particular. It had regretted the termination of her engagement with the household. It had enclosed a quarter's wages beyond what was owed. It had wished her well. It had been written in a clerk's hand and signed, she had understood, without Edmund Ashford ever having read it. That was the particular quality of the wound. Not that he had been cruel, but that he had been absent. She had been removed as one removes a piece of furniture that no longer suits the room, efficiently and without ceremony, by people acting on instructions from a man who could not bring himself to look at what he was doing. She picked up the invitation again. She smoothed it once between her fingers. Then she went to find her one good evening gown and see what the hour and a pressing iron might do. The dining room at Ashford Park ran the full width of the south wing, and in November it was lit by candelabras ranged down the length of the table so that the shadows beyond the light were absolute. Cecily entered at 4 minutes past 7, because the East Wing corridor was longer than she had remembered, and the footman who had been sent to collect her had led her, she suspected deliberately, by the shortest possible route rather than the correct one, so that she arrived slightly breathless, her gloves not quite straight. Edmund Ashford stood at the head of the table. She had not let herself think about what it would be like to see him again. She had not permitted herself that particular vulnerability on the journey north from Bath, or during the 2 days she had been in the house, during which she had moved between Matilda's rooms and the music room with the focused efficiency of someone who had been given a specific task and intended to complete it before anything else could go wrong. She had heard his footsteps in the corridor on the morning after her arrival. She had turned, and he had been there, gray-eyed and still, in a navy coat with the cravat precisely knotted at his throat. He had looked at her for a moment that went on longer than it should have. Then he had walked past without speaking. She had understood, in that corridor, that nothing had changed. Standing in the doorway of the dining room now, she revised that understanding. He was watching her arrive with an expression she could not name. Not coldness. Not pleasure. Something measured and careful. The expression of a man who has decided what he will do before he does it, and is in the process of doing it very precisely. Lady Constance Ashford stood at her son's right hand, and she turned to look at Cecily with the particular quality of attention that a woman of her generation could deploy like weather. She had not visibly aged in 3 years. Her gown was iron-gray silk, and her pearls caught the candlelight with the certainty of objects that have always belonged exactly where they are. She leaned, very slightly, toward her son. Her voice was low, calibrated for privacy, and it reached Cecily anyway in the quiet of the room. "A music teacher," she said. "Nothing more. I do not understand why she has been seated." Edmund did not answer. He pulled out the chair to his left and waited. The third person at the table was a woman Cecily did not know, though she placed her immediately. Dark-haired, beautifully dressed, wearing the expression of someone who has been arranged rather than invited. Lady Dorothea Petworth, she would learn, was a widow of 28 with property in Northamptonshire, and an easy social confidence that occupied a room the way warm water occupies a cup. She was, Cecily understood without being told, the reason the household had been aired out and the good china brought up. She was the correct choice, set here for someone to make. Cecily sat down and reached for her water glass and told herself to be grateful for the candles, because in that light, a very composed face can pass for a serene one. She had not come back to Ashford Park for Edmund Ashford. She had come back because of a letter written in a child's unsteady hand on paper that had been folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft, the kind of folding that happens when a letter is written, reconsidered, written again, and finally sent with the desperation of someone who has run out of options. Matilda Ashford, 12 years old, ward of the Duke, niece to the late Duchess, had written 6 lines. That she had been ill. That since the illness she could not make the words come out right when she spoke them, and so she had stopped speaking. That she had tried to play the piano and could not make her hands remember how. That she had written to Cecily because she did not know who else to ask. That she was sorry if she was not supposed to write. That she would understand if Cecily could not come. Cecily had read the letter once on a Tuesday evening in her Bath sitting room with the fire low and the light already failing. By Wednesday morning she had written to Mrs. Farrow and begun to pack. She had not written to Edmund Ashford. She had not asked his permission. She had considered this and decided it was not the kind of consideration that should delay her, which was, she recognized, exactly the sort of decision that had made her difficult to categorize inside a house that ran on hierarchy. She was not a guest. She had not been invited. She was a woman who had been banished and had returned anyway because a child needed her, and she intended to be useful, and then go home before the situation became something it was not. The situation had begun to become something it was not approximately 6 hours after her arrival, when she sat down at the piano bench in the music room, and Matilda climbed up beside her, took her hand in both of hers, and held it for a long time without writing anything on the slate. Bath had not been difficult, precisely. It had been narrow. Her rooms above the milliner's shop in Pulteney Street were clean and well lit, and her pupils arrived on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons with sheet music tucked under their arms, and the patient, slightly martyred expressions of girls whose mothers had decided that accomplishment was non-negotiable. She had taught scales and simple pieces and the correct posture for the instrument, and she had been paid on time, and she had told herself regularly that this was a sufficient life, and that she had made something workable from what had been given to her. She did not dwell on Ashford Park. She did not permit herself to dwell on the year she had spent here after her father's death, teaching Matilda, and managing the morning room music sessions, and moving through rooms that had felt, for those 12 months, like something she was allowed to be part of. She had not permitted herself to dwell on the fact that Edmund Ashford had not spoken to her once in the weeks before the letter came, and that she had spent those weeks constructing reasons for his silence that did not include the simplest. He simply wanted her gone. The soup arrived. The footman served with the practiced invisibility of his training, and the table arranged itself into the geometry of a dinner party that everyone present understood. Edmund spoke, which surprised her. He spoke to her directly, which surprised her more. "Miss Vane," he said. "Matilda ate at table this morning for the first time in 3 weeks." She looked at him. The candle sat between them like a small formal frontier. "She is stronger than she gives herself credit for," Cecily said. "She simply needed the pieces to come back to her hands. They will." Lady Constance set down her spoon. "Matilda has an excellent physician attending her," she said, "and a governess. What she requires now is rest and stability, not the intervention of—" And here she paused, with the quality of a woman who has already chosen her word and is simply deciding whether to use it. A music teacher. Nothing more. The phrase had not been used at the dinner table until now, but it had been present in the room since Cecily arrived, fully furnished and waiting. Edmund turned to his mother. The movement was small and deliberate. "Miss Vane was kind enough to return on short notice," he said. "I believe the journey from Bath is not inconsiderable." It was not warmth. It was the minimum sufficient correction, delivered with the economy of a man who would not perform what he did not feel. Lady Constance received it with the slight stiffening of someone who has been redirected without being defeated. Lady Dorothea studied the arrangement of silver at her place setting with diplomatic attention. Cecily kept her eyes on her soup and breathed in through her nose very carefully, and told herself that she did not know what this dinner was, and that not knowing was acceptable, and that the task was to be here, and to eat the soup, and to return to Matilda in the morning. He asked, before the fish course arrived, that she remain after the ladies withdrew. He said it simply, as he seemed to say most things, without ornamentation. Lady Constance's gaze moved from him to Cecily, and back in a quick, assessing arc. There are moments that feel like a room tilting. The fish course arrived, and the conversation redistributed itself around Lady Dorothea's account of her estate in Northamptonshire and Lady Constance's gracious attentions, and Cecily sat in the warm edge of the candlelight and watched Edmund Ashford not look at her for the next 40 minutes with the precise, studied attention of a man who is doing it deliberately. Lady Dorothea spoke well. She spoke about her estate with the informed ease of someone who has managed it herself since her husband's death, and found the work more agreeable than the marriage. Though she would not say the second part aloud, only imply it by the particular way she described the drainage problem in the South Field and its eventual resolution. She was, Cecily thought, genuinely intelligent and worth listening to, which made it easier to listen to her, because it meant the listening was not a performance of patience, but something honest. Lady Constance was attentive. She asked about the Petworth property with the precise calibration of a woman who knows exactly how many acres she is discussing. She guided the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who has been running tables like this for 30 years and knows that the goal of a dinner is never the food. She looked at Cecily twice, briefly, with an expression that was not cruelty, and was not warmth, and was approximately the expression of someone reassessing an earlier position without wishing to be seen doing so. Edmund said, at one point during the remove, that the roads north had been good this week, which was addressed to no one in particular, and which struck Cecily as the remark of a man filling a silence he did not want Lady Constance to fill first. She watched him across the table. She had spent 12 months in this house 3 years ago and had observed him in a considerable variety of circumstances, formal and informal, difficult and routine, and she had formed an understanding of him that she had subsequently tried very hard to discard and had not entirely managed. The understanding was simple. Edmund Ashford was a man who expressed care through the management of logistics. He did not say, "I am concerned about you." He said, "The roads are good," meaning you arrived safely. He did not say, "I am glad you came." He arranged a formal dinner and had her seated at his left hand. He did not say, "Stay, not yet." But he had spoken her name to his mother with the flat authority of a correction rather than a request. And she knew what that meant, even if she was not yet sure what to do with the knowledge. The dinner ran another half-hour. The pudding was a syllabub with candied orange peel. Very good. And Cecily ate it with the focused attention of someone who has been reminding herself at regular intervals to eat. The candles burned lower. The window glass went fully dark outside the curtains. Lady Dorothea described a musical evening she had attended in London the previous spring, and Cecily contributed 2 sentences about a concert she had managed to attend in Bath. And Lady Constance listened to both of them with the expression of a woman who is reconsidering which conversation she would prefer to be having. When Edmund set down his glass and looked at Cecily with the particular quality of his most direct attention, she was not entirely unprepared for it, but it cost her something anyway. If you have been wondering what could bring a woman back to a house that cast her out, and what could bring a man to seat her at his table after 3 years of silence, stay close. This story has not yet told you the simplest thing. The ladies withdrew at 9:30. Lady Constance with a glance at her son that contained a full argument in it. Lady Dorothea with the graceful composure of someone too well-bred to acknowledge what she was being asked to leave. Edmund waited until the door had fully closed. Then he poured 2 glasses of wine, left both on the table untouched, and stood. "Come," he said. "There is something in the music room." He did not say please. He had never said please in her experience, and she had once spent 12 months in his household. She had, in that year, understood that his commands had a particular quality, the quality of a man who does not order things he does not intend to ensure, and that what read as curtness was in practice a form of guarantee. "Come, and you will arrive somewhere safe. Sit down, and someone will see to it. Stop working, and the work will be managed." She had understood this at the time, and had also found it maddening. And she followed him now down the corridor toward the north wing, with that double understanding restored in her chest like something retrieved from a drawer. The music room was dark, except for 2 candles he lit from the hall sconce. Matilda's slate lay on the piano bench, and on the music stand above the keys there was a single sheet of manuscript paper. Handwritten in a confident script she recognized immediately. The first page of the Clementi Sonatina in G. Margaret's handwriting. Margaret, who had been copying it out from memory in the week before her death, on the doctor's orders, because he had said that light activity would be beneficial, and Margaret had decided that light activity meant sitting at the piano and writing music by hand for the niece she had loved. Cecily stood very still. "Matilda had it under her pillow," Edmund said from behind her. "She showed it to you the night you arrived." "She did. She has not shown it to anyone else." Cecily did not trust herself to turn around. She looked at Margaret's handwriting on the page. The notes, careful and even. The page unfinished at the bottom, where the last bar had not been completed. "She gave it to me to keep," Cecily said. "I have it in my room." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "You came back because she wrote to you?" "Yes." "She did not tell me she had written?" "No." The room held the silence for a moment in the way rooms do when what needs to be said is already present and waiting only for someone to be the first to say it. "Why did you send for me tonight?" Cecily asked. "To dinner, I mean. It was not necessary." She heard him move, the small sound of a coat's sleeve, and his hand went briefly to the left breast of his coat, a quick, unconscious touch at the place a pocket sat. The kind of gesture a person makes without meaning to. "Because I owe you a proper welcome," he said, "and I did not know how to give one in a corridor." She turned then. He was standing 2 feet from her, with his hands at his sides, and his face in the candlelight stripped of the usual management it wore in rooms with other people in them. He looked, she thought, extraordinarily tired in the way of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time. She said nothing. It seemed to her that nothing was the correct response. 2 days passed. November deepened, and the morning frosts came earlier, and Cecily and Matilda worked through the music room in the long, quiet afternoons, while Edmund Ashford moved through the house in his particular way, present and contained, occasionally visible in a doorway or at the end of a corridor. Lady Constance kept her counsel. Lady Dorothea remained because the roads were uncertain and the house was comfortable, and because she was, whatever else could be said of her, a woman of practical intelligence who was perfectly capable of assessing a situation. On the third afternoon, Cecily was playing through the Clementi with Matilda's hands under hers, guiding the fingering at the passages that had given the child difficulty, when she became aware that the doorway was occupied. If you have ever watched someone hear a piece of music that belongs to a part of their life they have not been able to open, you will know what her hands did. They stilled, very slightly, on Matilda's. Then she made herself continue, because the passage was at a delicate point, and stopping would undo 10 minutes of work, and because Matilda had not yet noticed what was behind them. Matilda's hand moved off the keys. She reached for the slate and wrote something, and held it up for Cecily to read. He used to listen from the door when Mother played. Cecily set down Matilda's hand gently on her own knee. She turned. Edmund was in the doorway with the expression of a man who has been caught doing something he had not planned to confess. The light from the corridor was behind him, and the music room was dim, and for a moment he simply stood there, which was, she would think later, the most honest she had ever seen him. She said nothing. Matilda slid off the bench and went to him, and he put his hand briefly on the child's head with the unconscious tenderness of someone who does not think about that gesture anymore, because it has simply become what he does. He looked at Cecily. She played it in the mornings, he said. For the last 2 months, she was learning the bass line. He stopped. He began again, with the effortful deliberateness of someone lifting something very carefully so as not to drop it. After she was gone, I could not hear it played. I could not hear anything she had liked. The rooms were wrong, the corridors were wrong. You were, he said, and his voice was level, but just barely. Everywhere she had been. Cecily listened. Her hands rested in her lap, very still. I sent you away because I could not grieve with you here, he said. Not because you had done anything wrong. I want you to know that you did nothing wrong. The candle on the music stand had burned low, and the light was doing something tender and inconvenient to the room. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought of the servant's entrance and the cart and the letter she had read on the road south and the 18 months in Bath before she had stopped flinching when she heard the particular cadence of a post-chaise on cobblestones. I know, she said, because she had always known this, actually, in the way one knows things that are too painful to examine directly. I had worked it out, eventually. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly. More the thing that comes before relief, when you have expected worse and received something closer to truth. If you have stayed this long, then you know that the worst of it was not the banishment. The worst of it was that she had understood him, even when he had not understood himself. And that understanding had not made the 3 years any easier to carry. 3 days after the music room, Mrs. Farrow came to Cecily's door at 8 in the morning with the expression of someone delivering information she has been given no choice about. A carriage would be brought round at 10. A letter from her ladyship was on the tray. A stipend was enclosed, generous. The kind of generosity that is meant to make the recipient feel that the expulsion is a gift. Cecily read Lady Constance's letter at the small writing desk in the corner of her room. It was beautifully written. It expressed the household's gratitude for her attention to Matilda in this difficult period. It noted that Matilda's physician had recommended a course of treatment that would begin in a fortnight and would best be pursued with the minimum of additional household change. It wished Cecily every happiness in her future endeavors, and it enclosed, with the family's warmest regards, £15. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She had known, she supposed, that this was one of the ways it could end. She had known when she came back that there was no guaranteed position awaiting her, no formal restoration of anything that had been taken. She had come for Matilda, and Matilda was better. And in Lady Constance's careful accounting, that meant the purpose of her visit had been served, and the visiting could now conclude. It was, in the logic of the household's management, entirely coherent. Lady Constance was not wrong. She was not wrong about most things. She was merely applying a correct analysis to a situation she had not fully seen. Cecily thought about the music room 3 nights ago. She thought about Edmund standing in the doorway in the candlelight, and his voice when he had spoken of Margaret, the deliberateness of it, the effortful honesty of a man who has spent 3 years refusing to speak of something and has finally decided to speak of it to the right person. She thought about his hand on Matilda's head and the way the child had leaned into the gesture with the uncalculating trust of someone who has been protected long enough to believe that protection is reliable. She thought about what he had said in the music room. "I will not make the same mistake again." She thought about what she had understood him to mean. Then she thought about the letter in her hands and the £15 and the carriage at 10. She had passed, on the way back from the East Corridor that morning, Lady Constance's housemaid in conversation with the housekeeper from the Petworth household. She had not slowed her step. She had not needed to. The maid's voice reached her plainly. A music teacher. Nothing more. And her ladyship says she ought never to have been invited to dine. The words had been said with the complete confidence of someone relaying a position from a source who would not be contradicted. She understood that intentions are not logistics, and that what Edmund Ashford meant and what his household would arrange were 2 different things, and that she was a woman without rank or property or claim, and that the hierarchy had its own opinions about what she was owed. She set the letter down. She opened her trunk. In the corridor outside, she could hear the small sounds of Matilda's mourning, the shuffling footstep, and the sound of the slate being set down on the stone floor. The child had come to find her, as she came every morning, to sit for a moment outside the door before breakfast. Cecily sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap. The door opened. Matilda stood in it, dark-eyed and slight, her hair not yet dressed, the slate under her arm. She looked at the trunk. She looked at Cecily. She crossed the room and took Cecily's hand in both of hers, exactly as she had done on the night of Cecily's arrival, and held it. They sat like that for some time, without the slate, without any means of translation. The child's grip the one plain fact in the room. The carriage was in the front drive at 9:30, 20 minutes early, which was either administrative efficiency or a particular variety of urgency. Cecily stood in the East Wing corridor with her bonnet in her hands and her trunk at the porter's feet, and the door to the house behind her, and the bright November cold ahead. Edmund Ashford came around the corner of the entrance hall at 9:20. He stopped when he saw the carriage. He looked at the trunk. He looked at Cecily. Then he looked at the carriage again with the particular expression of a man running a very quick and very precise calculation. He turned and went back into the house without speaking. She stood in the cold and waited, because she did not know what else to do, and because Matilda's hand had left a warmth in hers that she was not ready to put down yet. He came back in 4 minutes. He came through the house door and down the 2 steps and stood in the drive without a coat in the November morning, and the quality of his stillness was different from every other quality of stillness she had witnessed in him, which was notable because she had witnessed a considerable number. "Wait," he said to the carriage driver. Then he went back inside. She heard, from within the house, the sound of a door opening in the south wing. The drawing room. She heard Lady Constance's voice, low and even, and then Edmund's, lower, and then a silence, and then a single brief sentence in Edmund's voice that she could not make out through the stone walls. Then nothing. Then footsteps. He came back out. He stood in front of her in the November light without his coat, and with his breath visible in the cold air. And he looked at her with the direct quality of a man who has finished calculating and arrived at the result. "She stays," he said. It was not quite loud enough to be announcement, but it was loud enough for the 2 footmen at the door to hear it, and the porter and the carriage driver and Lady Dorothea Petworth, who had appeared in the upper window and stood looking down at the drive with the serene expression of someone watching the conclusion of something they had expected. He said it again, levelly, as though the sentence needed to be twice said to be real. "She stays. She has always had a place here." The cold morning was very quiet after that. The rook called again from the elms. One of the footmen cleared his throat, softly, with the muffled necessity of someone who has had a feeling they did not expect. Inside, through the drawing-room window, Cecily could see the outline of Lady Constance, the gray silk, the pearls, the particular quality of her stillness that was different from Edmund's stillness, in exactly the way granite is different from carved stone. Lady Constance had the stillness of something waiting to decide. She stood very straight, with her fan in her left hand, not deployed but held, and she looked at her son in the drive with an expression that Cecily could not read from this distance, and that after a moment shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something that was not quite concession, but was adjacent to it. Lady Dorothea had disappeared from the upper window. She reappeared in the drawing-room doorway behind Lady Constance, paused to observe the scene in the drive, and then placed one hand briefly on Lady Constance's arm, a gesture so small and so precisely offered that it read as both acknowledgment and farewell. A rook called somewhere in the elms at the edge of the park. The carriage driver looked at no one in particular. The footman looked at the middle distance with practiced intensity. Cecily looked at Edmund Ashford standing coatless in the November cold, with the Duke of Ashford's full household arranged around him and his gray eyes on her face. And she understood, in the way one understands things that have been coming for a long time, that he had not said it to the drive or to the household or to his mother. He had said it to her. "You will take cold," she said. Something moved in his face that had not moved there before, or not in her presence. It was brief and unguarded, and it was, she thought, approximately what relief looks like on a face that has not used it in some time. "Come inside," he said. "Matilda will want breakfast." She went inside. She kept her bonnet in her hands, because the moment felt too delicate for the mundanity of putting it away. And she walked beside him through the entrance hall and into the house that was, she understood now, not going to let her go again. The floor was cold stone, and the entrance hall smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and the November damp that never entirely left this part of the north wing, and all of it was so precisely itself, so recognizably Ashford Park, that she felt it in her chest the way one feels a sound that has been missing for a long time and has finally come back. Lady Constance did not appear for luncheon. Cecily learned from Mrs. Farrow, with the particular neutrality of a housekeeper who knows when to be silent about what she has seen, that her ladyship had a headache and had requested a tray in her rooms. The headache was almost certainly not a headache, but it was the form that allowed a woman of Lady Constance's dignity to absorb a reversal without having to absorb it in public, and Cecily was grateful for the convention. She did not want victory. She wanted Matilda's hand in hers and the music room, and the particular quality of the morning light in the east wing at 7:30. And those were not things that required anyone to be defeated. Lady Constance came down for dinner. She came down in her gray silk with her pearls, and she sat at the table with the composure of a woman who has decided that equanimity is the appropriate register for the situation. And she spoke to Cecily with the careful courtesy of someone revising a position they have held for a long time. It was not warmth. It was the beginning of warmth's infrastructure, which is harder to build and more lasting when it finally stands. Lady Dorothea took her leave gracefully at 2:00 that same afternoon, with the composed equanimity of a woman who has sufficient self-possession to recognize when a situation has resolved without requiring her to have understood it in its particulars. She pressed Cecily's hand at the door. She said nothing, which was, in its way, the most eloquent thing she had offered in 3 days. There was no formal declaration that afternoon. No conversation of the kind that arranges itself into questions and answers and the filing away of intentions. Edmund Ashford did not, in the weeks that followed, do things in the conventional sequence. He had never been, as far as Cecily could determine, a man who understood that the conventional sequence existed for the convenience of the people who did not yet know what they were doing. He knew what he was doing. He had perhaps always known. The knowing had simply required a particular kind of courage, and courage of that kind tends to arrive, in people like Edmund Ashford, only when the alternative has been made concrete. He began to eat at the same time as Matilda, in the morning room, when previously he had eaten alone. He began to come to the music room in the early afternoons, not to instruct, but to sit, with a book or correspondence, in the chair near the fire. He would read without speaking for an hour, and Cecily would work through pieces with Matilda without acknowledging him. And the room would hold all three of them in the particular way of rooms that are being reclaimed from grief, slowly and without announcement. He began, also, to listen. She had noticed this about him years ago and set it aside, uncertain she had the right to name it. He gave people the full resource of his attention when he chose to. And being attended to by Edmund Ashford was a different experience from being attended to by almost anyone else she had encountered, because he did not listen in order to reply. He listened in order to understand, and understanding was the thing he did with great care, and very quietly, so that you did not always know it was happening until you had said something you had not intended to say, and found that you did not mind. He began to speak to Cecily in the evenings the way people speak when they have decided to stop being careful about how much they reveal, which is to say, carefully, but about things that matter. He told her, one evening, about Margaret. Not the circumstances of her death, which Cecily had known already in the general way that a household knows such things, but the quality of her. The way she had laughed, the particular precision of her affections. The last morning, which he had been present for, and which had been, he said, both better and worse than he had imagined. He told her these things in the measured voice of a man who has finally found a person he trusts to hold them, and she listened without offering comfort he had not asked for, because this was what was needed, and she knew it. She told him, in return, about Bath. She was surprised to find she could be wry about it, about the Pulteney Street rooms and the daughters of merchants and the particular variety of the work, which was real and honest, but which had the quality of a life borrowed from someone else's expectations. He listened with the full quality of his attention, which was, she had discovered, absolute when he chose to give it. You should not have had to go, he said. No, she said, I should not have. I could not see clearly. I know. She looked at the fire. I know you could not. He was quiet, His hand rested on the arm of his chair, near hers, with the precision of proximity that people exercise when they are being deliberate about the distance they are maintaining. "I will not," he said very carefully, "make the same mistake again." It was not, she thought, the most romantic declaration that had ever been offered in a Regency drawing room. It was, however, exactly what Edmund Ashford would say. And it was true in the way only things said with difficulty tend to be true. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was entirely sufficient. 3 weeks later, the solicitor arrived from London with the correct paperwork, because Edmund Ashford was, above all else, a man who did the thing completely once he had decided to do it. On the night the papers were signed, and the household had been quietly informed, and Matilda had written good on her slate in the largest letters it would hold, Cecily went to the music room alone and found the sheet of music on the stand above the keys, the first page of the Clementi in Margaret's hand, still unfinished at the bottom. She sat down at the bench. She played the piece through to the end of the first page, following Margaret's notation exactly. And then she played the second page from memory. The notes her own hands had known for years. And the music moved through the quiet house the way it had been meant to move through it, gently and without end, filling the rooms that had been too long empty of it. The door opened. Edmund stood in it, as he had stood that November afternoon, with the corridor light behind him. Matilda was at his side, leaning against his arm, nearly asleep on her feet. Cecily played to the close of the sonatina. She let the last note sit in the room for a moment, before she lifted her hands. Edmund crossed to her, Matilda moving with him, and they stood in the lamplight beside the piano, with the sheet of music still open on the stand, and his hand found hers, where it rested on the bench, and held it, and the house settled around them with the particular quality of quiet that belongs to rooms that have finally been given back to the right people. She looked at the page above the keys. The last note had never been written. Now there was nowhere left for the music to go except forward into all the morning still ahead, and she thought that was, on the whole, exactly right. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Thank you for sitting in the quiet with me until the end.